40 tons of screaming steel suspended between two trees. That's what a Washington Skagit yarder looked like when it was working. A machine so violent it could rip a 15-ton log off a mountainside and swing it through the air like a pendulum from hell. The cables alone weighed more than a pickup truck. The drums that wound them could pull with 200,000 pounds of force, enough to drag a locomotive up a cliff face. The Skagit yarder didn't care about gravity. It didn't care about terrain. It laughed at mountains that would break a man's back just to climb. You want that Douglas fir sitting 3/4 of a mile up a 70-degree slope? The Skagit would go get it, and it would do it by stringing cables through the sky like a mechanical spider and yanking logs through the air at speeds that turned timber into missiles. This wasn't logging. This was aerial combat against a forest, and the forest never stood a chance. Picture this for a second. You're standing at the base of a ravine in the Cascade Mountains, 1952. The fog is so thick you can barely see the trees 50 feet ahead. Above you, somewhere in that gray soup, a cable is humming, not the pleasant hum of a guitar string. The death hum of a steel rope under 40,000 pounds of tension. The sound that means if anything snaps, if anything slips. If physics decides to have a bad day, men are going to die in ways that'll require a closed casket. Then you hear it, a distant crack, a rush of air, and suddenly a log the length of a school bus comes screaming out of the mist, suspended by chokers, swinging 30 feet off the ground at 20 miles an hour. That was high-lead logging. That was skyline yarding. That was Tuesday. Today we design warehouses where robots handle boxes because humans might strain their backs. We have sensors that shut down conveyor belts if a finger gets too close. We've got machines that won't start unless you're wearing 3 forms of personal protective equipment and have completed a 4-hour safety certification. But 70 years ago, in the wet green mountains of Washington and Oregon, men climbed onto platforms bolted to cable towers and operated machines that could turn a miscalculation into a funeral. No kill switches, no redundant systems, just a whistle signal, a lever, and your own judgment about whether that cable looked a little too frayed today. The riggers who climbed the spar trees, no safety harnesses until the 1960s, just spur boots and a climbing belt. 150 feet straight up a trunk that could be swaying in the wind, with nothing but your grip between you and the ground. The choker setters who hooked the logs, they worked in the brush out of sight of the yarder operator, signaling with whistles that had to cut through engine noise and distance. If the carriage came back before they were clear, if a log kicked sideways when tension hit, if the main line parted and whipped back at them, well, that's what the first aid kit was for. The first aid kit was usually a bottle of whiskey and a ride to the nearest doctor 40 miles of logging road away. This is the story of the high-lead yarder, the skyline logging system that dragged timber off mountains that couldn't be reached any other way. The iron donkeys that screamed in the fog and made the Pacific Northwest economy possible. And the generation of men who ran them, knowing that the wilderness was trying to kill them, Every single hour they worked and coming back the next morning anyway. Let's go back to the problem these machines were built to solve. The Pacific Northwest had the most valuable timber on the continent. Douglas fir that grew 250 feet tall. Western red cedar so rot resistant you could bury it for a century and pull it up still solid. Sitka spruce with grain tight enough to build airplane frames. One tree could be worth a small fortune if you could get it off the mountain, and therein lay the nightmare. These weren't gentle rolling hills, the Cascades, the Olympics, the Coast Range. This was terrain that went from sea level to vertical in the space of a few hundred yards, slopes so steep that rain didn't soak in. It ran off like water down a window. Ravines choked with underbrush, where you couldn't see a log from 20 feet away. Ground so unstable that the old-growth giants had root systems spreading 50 feet wide just to stay upright. The timber barons wanted those trees. The railroads wanted those trees. America wanted those trees. But getting them out? That was the question that broke men and bankrupted companies for decades. The first answer was simple. Roll them downhill. Splash dams, flumes, gravity. Cut the tree, bucket into logs, and let physics do the work. Which was fine until you ran out of trees near water, until the easy slopes were stripped bare, until you needed the timber that was 3 miles up a canyon with no river access and terrain so rugged that horses couldn't climb it. Ground-based logging, skidding logs with steam donkeys along the forest floor, worked on flat land. But in the steep country, dragging logs tore up the ground so bad it caused landslides, ripped out everything in the skid path, and it was slow, brutally slow. Moving logs a few hundred feet could take all day. The companies needed a way to move timber through the air, over the obstacles, above the terrain that made ground logging a death trap. Enter the high-lead system. Here's the concept. Instead of dragging logs along the ground, you hoist them. Not completely off the ground. That takes too much power, but high enough that the lead end lifts clear while the back end drags. It's like a partial airlift. The log swings under a pulley suspended from a cable strung high above the brush, and the yarder reels it in. To make this work, you need 3 things. First, you need a spar tree, a tower essentially, but instead of building one from steel, the early loggers used the forest itself. They'd pick the biggest, straightest tree near the landing, limb it to a bare pole, top it at 150 or 200 feet, and strap a pulley block to the top. That tree became the anchor point for the whole operation. Every cable in the system ran through it or attached to it. Second, you need a yarder, the engine that does the pulling. The Washington Iron Works Skagit yarders were among the biggest, meanest examples ever built. Massive diesel engines, sometimes 2 of them, powering drums that could hold thousands of feet of cable. The operator sat in an enclosed cab surrounded by levers and throttles, watching the cables through a slit window, listening for whistle signals, feeling the machine respond to loads that could shift without warning. Third, you need cables. Lots of cables. The main line that runs from the yarder up to the spar tree and out to where the logs are. The haul-back line that brings the empty carriage back out after a turn. The guy lines that brace the spar tree against forces that would snap it like a matchstick without support. The chokers that wrap around individual logs. A working high-lead show was a web of steel rope under tension, every line dependent on every other line. The forces involved were staggering. The main line alone could be under 40,000 pounds of pull. Guy lines saw forces that would stretch a lesser rope to failure, and all of it ran through sheaves, pulleys, and blocks that were made of cast iron and steel, components that worked perfectly until they didn't, and when they didn't, people died. The Skagit Yarder was the heart of this system. Washington Iron Works built them in Everett, Washington, starting in the early 1900s and continuing through the decades as the designs evolved. Early models ran on steam fired by wood cut right there in the forest, burning trees to move trees. Later models switched to diesel, which was more reliable and didn't need a dedicated fireman stoking a boiler all day. A typical Skagit had a mainline drum and a haulback drum, both controlled by the operator through friction clutches and brakes. You'd engage the mainline to pull logs in. You'd engage the haulback to send the empty rigging back out. The skill was in the coordination, in knowing how fast to pull, how much slack to leave, when to stop instantly because a whistle just told you something went wrong. The drums were massive. On a Skagit SJ3, the mainline drum could hold 3,000 feet of 1.25-inch cable. That's over half a mile of steel rope, wound tight, under tension that could cut a man in half if it parted. The operator didn't have cameras, didn't have sensors, couldn't see the rigging crew most of the time. Everything depended on sound, the whistle signals, the pitch of the engine, the vibration of the cables. An experienced yarder operator could tell from the sound alone whether the load was moving clean or hanging up, could feel through the levers whether the carriage was running smooth or about to jump the skyline. They called the yarder a donkey because the early steam versions were like mechanical pack animals, stubborn, loud, and capable of moving loads no team of horses could budge. But the Skagit yarders weren't donkeys, they were wolves. They were machines with 500 horsepower and cables tight enough to play like guitar strings, and they ate the forest one log at a time. Let's talk about rigging, because that's where men earned their money and lost their lives. The rigging crew was out there in the brush, away from the yarder, wrestling with equipment that didn't forgive mistakes. Their job was to set the chokers on logs, signal the yarder to pull, then clear the area before thousands of pounds of timber started moving. The choker setter was the lowest man on the totem pole, usually the youngest guy in the crew, because experience meant you'd moved up to something slightly less lethal. Your job was to run out to where the logs lay, wrap a steel cable around each one, and hook it to the carriage before the next pull. Sounds simple. It wasn't. You're working on a 60-degree slope. The ground is covered in slash, branches, bark, and debris from felling operations that can hide holes deep enough to swallow you. There are logs everywhere, lying at angles, some stable, some ready to roll if you breathe on them wrong. The weather is either rain, which makes everything slick, or fog, which means you can't see the carriage coming until it's 30 feet away. You hear the whistle signal. 3 short blasts means the rigging is coming back. You grab the choker, a steel rope maybe 3/4 of an inch thick with a bell and a knob on the ends. You scramble to the log you're after, which might be partially buried, might be hung up on another log, might be balanced on debris in a way that looks stable but isn't. You wrap the choker around the log near the lead end. You connect the knob to the bell, forming a loop that'll tighten when tension hits. You hook the choker to the butt rigging, the assembly that dangles from the carriage, collecting multiple chokers so you can pull 3, 4, 5 logs at once. Then you get out. You scramble uphill because when that load moves, you don't want to be below it. You don't want to be anywhere near the plane of travel, because logs don't always go straight. They swing, they kick. They find every obstacle on the path between where they are and where the yarder wants them, and they hit those obstacles with momentum that can turn a stump into shrapnel. The rigging slinger was the crew boss. He decided which logs to rig in what order. He watched for hazards. He gave the whistle signals. His experience could keep men alive, and his mistakes could get them killed. The signals were a language unto themselves. 1 long whistle, stop. 2 short whistles, slack the main line. 3 short, slack the haul back. 4 short, tighten the main line. The patterns varied by operation, but the principle was the same. The yarder operator couldn't see you. You had to tell him what to do with sound alone. Miss a signal? The operator might keep pulling when you need slack, might reel in when you're still hooking up, might not know that someone's caught in the rigging until the screaming starts. The whistle punk was often a kid, literally a teenager, whose only job was to relay signals. He'd stand where he could see both the rigging crew and the yarder passing signals back and forth. On big shows there might be multiple whistle punks forming a relay chain. It was considered an entry-level job, but it was also a job where screwing up the timing could get someone killed. And then there was the high climber, the rigger who climbed the spar tree. You want to understand what kind of men worked this job? Picture this. It's 5:30 in the morning. The fog hasn't lifted. You're standing at the base of a Douglas fir that's been selected to become the spar tree for this operation. The tree is maybe 8 feet in diameter at the base. The first limb is 60 feet up. The top, where you're going to cut it off, is 180 feet above your head. You're wearing cork boots, leather boots with metal spikes on the soles for grip. You've got a lineman's belt around your waist, a steel core climbing rope attached to it. Strapped to your belt, a double-bitted axe, a handsaw, extra rope. The climbing spurs are buckled to your legs, curved steel spikes that bite into the bark when you kick. There's no safety harness. The technology existed, but most climbers didn't use them. Said it slowed them down, said it got in the way. You flip the climbing rope around the trunk, lean back into the belt, and kick your spurs into the bark. Then you flip the rope higher, lean back, kick the spurs higher, flip, kick, 3 feet at a time. working your way up a trunk that's swaying slightly in the wind that you can't feel yet but will feel plenty soon. By the time you reach the first limb, you're 60 feet up and your legs are burning. The view's better up here. You can see the fog lying in the valleys. You can see the landing where the yarder will sit. You can see the next ridge over, where another show is already running, cables visible across the skyline like threads of a giant web. You've got limbs to cut. You chop each one off with the axe, letting them fall away from the trunk. The higher you go, the more the tree sways. At 100 feet, you can feel it responding to gusts you can barely perceive. At 150 feet, the trunk is maybe 4 feet in diameter, and the sway is measured in feet, back and forth like a slow metronome. At 180 feet, you're going to top the tree. Cut off everything above this point, leaving a bare pole with a flat top where the rigging will attach. You make your undercut first. A notch on the side, you want the top to fall. Then you start the back cut with the saw, working through wood that's denser than anything you've cut closer to the ground. The tree is groaning, the saw is binding. You're 180 feet in the air, on a platform of nothing but bark sawing through your own support. Then the crack. The top starts to go. It tips away from you, accelerating, and as it falls, the spar tree, your spar tree, the one you're attached to, whips back in the opposite direction. Newton's third law, applied at altitude. The kick is violent. The spar swings 40 feet in the opposite direction from the falling top, and you are holding on with everything you've got, your spurs dug in deep, your belt taking the G-forces, waiting for the oscillation to dampen. Some climbers rode that kick whooping. Some got thrown off and died before they knew what happened. Once the topping was done, you'd rig the block at the top, the pulley assembly that would hold the main line, and the bull block partway down, and the guy line attachments that would stabilize everything once the cables went on. The whole climb might take 2 hours. The descent was faster. You'd ride down on a controlled slide, spurs and rope and gravity working together, hit the ground with your legs shaking, your arms feeling like rubber. Then you'd walk over to the yarder and go to work running that too, because climbers were usually the most experienced men in the crew, and experience was what kept operations from killing everyone. The danger didn't stop at the rigging. The whole system was essentially a machine for generating lethal energy and directing it at logs. When things went wrong, that energy went somewhere else. Cables parted. A main line under 40,000 pounds of tension stores enormous potential energy. When it fails, when a strand frays through, or a splice gives way, or a weakened section finally decides today's the day, that cable doesn't just drop. It whips back at the speed of sound. Men standing anywhere in the plane of travel got cut in half, got wrapped around trees, got launched into the air. The old-timers could tell you about cable strikes like combat veterans describing mortar rounds. The sound a parting line makes, a crack like thunder, followed by the whistle of high-speed steel cutting air. The aftermath, finding the pieces, logs came loose, a choker slips, a knob pulls through a bell. Suddenly you've got 15 tons of timber swinging free on a system designed to move it fast. It rotates. It kicks sideways. It finds the path of least resistance, which is sometimes through a man who was standing in what looked like a safe spot. Trees fell where they shouldn't. Widowmakers, dead limbs hung up in the canopy, came down without warning. Standing dead, snags destabilized by the vibration of nearby logging toppled in unpredictable directions. The fog that sat in those valleys meant you couldn't always see what was coming until it was already there. The machinery itself was unforgiving. Get a hand caught in a cable spooling onto a drum, and the machine would take the hand before anyone could hit a kill switch, if there was a kill switch. Get clothing tangled in a moving part, and you'd follow the clothing into the gears. There are no good statistics for how many men died in high-lead logging. Records were spotty. Deaths in the woods sometimes didn't make it into official reports. Families got a oddie and maybe a week's wages, and the operation kept running because the timber company had contracts to fill. But the old-timers knew. They could name them. Tom, who got hit by the carriage in 54, Frank, whose choker slipped in 48, the kid from Minnesota who was on his second day and stepped into the bite of a line just as the yarda operator took up slack. The job had a body count. Everyone accepted it. Not because they didn't value life, but because the work had to get done and there was no other way to do it. The timber companies needed the logs. The men needed the wages. The country needed the lumber. Progress, as they said, wasn't built by the timid. The economics was simple and brutal. A high-lead show could move timber off terrain that was impossible for ground-based logging. One yarda, one rigging crew, one spar tree could log a setting that would have taken 10 times as long with any other method. The capital investment was huge. A Skagit yarda might cost $50,000 in 1950 money, the equivalent of $500,000 today. But the return was bigger. A single old-growth Douglas fir might contain 30,000 board feet of lumber. At prices that fluctuated with the market, that could be worth thousands of dollars per tree. One good setting might have 100 such trees. Clear it in a month and you'd grossed enough to pay for the yarder and the crew for a year. The timber companies understood this math. They pushed for speed. Time was money. Every day the cables weren't moving, every breakdown, every weather delay, that was profit disappearing. The men understood the math too. They were paid by production, not by the hour. The more logs moved, the fatter the paycheck. This created incentives that didn't always align with safety. Skip the inspection of that frayed cable, you save 10 minutes and you might be fine. Take shortcuts on rigging, you move faster and usually nothing goes wrong. Usually. The camps themselves were temporary cities. Bunkhouses, cookhouses, equipment sheds, all of it built to be moved when the timber ran out. The men lived where the work was, miles from anything resembling civilization, in conditions that would make a modern worker file for psychological disability. Wet clothes that never dried. Bunks so close together you could hear every snore, every cough, every nightmare. Food that was heavy on starch and protein because you burned 6,000 calories a day just working. Coffee so strong it didn't need the cup. They worked 6 days a week, often 7 during good weather, dawn to dusk, longer during summer. The forest didn't care about overtime laws, and when the setting was logged out, you moved, struck the camp, dismantled what could be salvaged, abandoned what couldn't, and started over somewhere else. The high climber would top a new spar tree, the rigging crew would string new cables, the yarder would fire up in a new location, and the whole brutal dance would begin again. The high lead era peaked in the 1940s and 50s. The timber was still big, the demand was insatiable, and the men who'd survived the Depression and the war weren't afraid of hard work or danger. But it couldn't last. The old growth was finite. A tree that took 500 years to grow could be dropped in an hour and yarded in a day. The ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest were being converted to lumber faster than anyone imagined possible, and eventually, inevitably, the supply began to thin. Environmental consciousness crept in. The public started noticing that their forest heritage was disappearing. Regulations tightened. Old growth protection movements gained strength. Clear-cutting practices that had been standard came under scrutiny. Technology evolved. The cable yarders didn't disappear. They're still used today on steep ground. But the systems got safer. Better cables, engineered spar towers instead of top trees, improved rigging practices, actual safety regulations that were actually enforced. The timber companies adapted. Second growth logging became the norm. Trees that were planted or allowed to regenerate after earlier cuts. Smaller trees, faster rotation, different economics. The massive old growth shows became historical artifacts. The men aged out. The generation that had learned rigging from their fathers, that had climbed spar trees with nothing but spurs and nerve, that had run yarders by sound and feel, they retired, they died, they took their knowledge with them. What remains today? In places like the Pacific Northwest, you can still find the scars. Old spar trees, their tops cut flat 60 years ago, standing dead or barely alive among the second growth. Cable grooves worn into the wood so deep they'll never heal. Old landings where the brush hasn't quite covered the compacted ground where yarders once sat. Museums display the equipment. You can see a Skagit yarder in Tacoma, in Everett, in half a dozen logging museums scattered through timber country. They're impressive machines, the massive drums, the reinforced frames, the operators' cabs where men once sat controlling forces that could move mountains. The technology survives in evolved form. Modern cable yarders use synthetic lines in some applications. They have computerized tension monitoring. They have cameras and radio communications and safety interlocks that the old-timers would have marveled at. But the spirit, that's harder to locate. The willingness to climb 180 feet up a swaying tree with nothing but spurs and a belt to cut the top off while standing on the trunk itself, to ride the kick when it went. That's not something you can replicate with better equipment. The rigging crews who worked in fog so thick they couldn't see each other, who communicated by whistle because there was no other way, who trusted each other's skill with their lives every single day. That kind of crew doesn't form in the same way when the stakes are lower. Those men built the Pacific Northwest. They built the cities of the West Coast. The houses, the bridges, the railroad trestles, the ships, the airplanes, all of it came from timber that someone had to get off a mountain, and the high lead yarder was how they did it. 40 tons of screaming steel, cables tight enough to hum, logs swinging through the fog like the pendulum of some industrial clock, counting off the seconds in board feet and payroll, progress measured in timber moved, risk measured in names on memorial lists. The wilderness pushed back, the cables held, and the forest came down one turn at a time. So the next time you're in a house framed with Douglas fir, or you see old photographs of the timber industry in its prime, or you drive through those green mountains where second growth has covered the evidence of what happened here, remember the men and the machines. Remember the high climbers who topped spar trees at dawn. Remember the choker setters who worked the slash. Remember the yarder operators who ran those iron donkeys by feel and sound and instinct. Remember the ones who didn't come home. They built this world. They built it loud, dangerous, and unforgiving. They built it knowing the cost, and they paid it anyway. The cables are quiet now. The yarders sit in museums. The spar trees are returning to the earth. But the work they did, that's still here. In every beam, every board, every structure that stands because someone once strung steel through the sky and pulled the impossible off a mountain, the age of the iron donkey is over. But the forest remembers. And somewhere in those hills, if you listen close enough, you can almost hear the whistle signals. 2 short blasts, 3 short. The hum of a cable under tension. The sound of men who weren't afraid of hard work. The sound of progress being carved out of the wilderness. One log at a time.